Okay, let's unpack this. When we think about the Holocaust, our minds instantly go to, the perpetrators, the victims, the immense scale of the killing.
And maybe the major Allied powers or the strictly neutral countries like Switzerland.
Exactly. But there's a crucial national story that often sits outside this established narrative. It's a story of contradiction, of courage, and of, well, immense complexity.
We're talking about the role of Turkey between 1933 and 1945.
It is perhaps one of the most difficult stories to tell, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it just resists any simple categorization.
It really does. Our sources today, and we're looking at a serious body of archival documents and scholarly analysis, they reveal a country that was simultaneously undergoing this radical post-Ottoman modernization.
While maintaining a really precarious armed neutrality right on the border of Nazi-occupied territories.
Right on the border.
So our mission today is a deep dive into this highly nuanced picture. We're looking at a place that offered life-saving humanitarian refuge to thousands of people.
Including some true intellectual giants.
But which also, in a shocking moment of internal policy, enforced these severe discriminatory economic policies against its own non-Muslim citizens. These two facts coexisted.
And we have sources detailing Turkey's role not just as a refuge, but as the critical transit point for Jewish people fleeing the extermination machine.
So the big question we're wrestling with is, how did Turkey manage this tightrope walk of neutrality and internal political pressures?
And what were the tangible, sometimes deeply contradictory outcomes for both Turkish Jewry and the European Jews who were so desperately seeking escape?
We're going deep into the moral gray zone. To understand Turkey's position during the war, we can't just start in 1939. We have to go back.
Centuries earlier, actually.
Because this wasn't a nation that was new to the idea of asylum. In fact, our sources suggest that Turkey, through its Ottoman history, played the global role of primary refuge long before the United States ever did.
That's a crucial insight. This tradition of providing asylum is rooted in the very early days of the Ottoman Empire, dating all the way back to the 14th century.
So as the early sultans were conquering Byzantine lands, they were finding Jewish minorities who had survived centuries of persecution.
Christian persecution, yes. And those Jewish communities often supported the invaders because they were expecting, and they received, a level of tolerance under Muslim Ottoman rule that was just unavailable anywhere else in Europe at the time.
And the most historically significant moment, the one that really cemented this tradition, that came in the 16th and 17th centuries.
After the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal?
Right.
Precisely. After 1492, Sultan Bayezid II provided safe harbor to thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing the Iberian Peninsula. And we're not just talking about Jews who had maintained their faith openly.
We have to specifically mention the Marranos and the Moriscos.
We do, and we should probably define those terms for you because they represent a very specific and targeted group.
Okay, so the Marranos.
The Marranos were Spanish and Portuguese Jews who had been forcibly converted to Catholicism but were still being persecuted because of suspicions that they were secretly maintaining their Jewish faith. The Moriscos were the Muslim equivalent.
So these groups were under immense pressure, violence, forced displacement.
Absolutely. And the Ottomans provided them not just transit, but a primary refuge, a place to actually reestablish their communities. And this wasn't just, a political move. It was a foundational act of state protection based on this idea that the Sultan's lands were a safe harbor.
That established a very powerful precedent then, a constitutional, sort of almost sacred principle of protection that existed before the Republic was even founded.
Yes. But that legacy was severely tested early in the Republic's life. And that brings us to the first major internal tension we need to talk about, the Thrace incidents of 1934.
The early 1930s were volatile globally. Nationalism was on the rise everywhere, and Turkey was no exception.
And the crisis began with a seemingly benign governmental order to clear border areas of foreigners. But this was fertile ground for extremist rumors.
And what fueled those rumors?
The insidious groundwork laid by Nazi propaganda. German-prepared Turkish translations of that infamous forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, were circulating widely through right-wing nationalist groups.
Which ignited these deep-seated fears that Jewish Turks were somehow plotting against the Republic with outside Zionist help?
Exactly. And starting on June 24th, 1934, that fear just exploded into violent attacks against local Jews in the Thrace region. The result was widespread looting, assaults, forced displacement.
Forcing most of the region's Jewish population to flee immediately toward the safety of Istanbul and Izmir. It created a real climate of fear right on Turkey's borders.
It did.
It sounds like an existential test for the young Turkish Republic. So how did the central government respond? What did that response signal about its core values?
The response was swift, coordinated, and very decisive, particularly once the true scale of the violence became clear. Initial news was actually suppressed because of a state visit by the Shah of Iran.
Ah, okay.
But once that was over, Prime Minister Hizmet Winu immediately returned to the capital, condemned the anti-Semitism, and ordered a thorough inquiry into the incidents.
And the response went right to the top, involving the founder of the republic himself, Ataturk.
Yes. On July 12, 1934, the Council of Ministers, chaired by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, issued a public declaration that set the law down very clearly. They stated the government would actively prevent boycotts, prevent any pressure for emigration, judge the offenses speedily.
And critically, permit the immediate return of Jews who had fled, guaranteeing their security.
Which is a commitment backed by action, not just words.
Right.
Absolutely. They sent soldiers and gendarmes to restore order. They dismissed the mayor and police chief of Kırklareli, holding officials directly responsible for their failure to protect citizens.
And in Uzumkupru, the district mayor issued an open invitation for Jews to return.
He did. He publicly guaranteed their security and stressed, "It is my duty to protect your security, and I will do it with all my strength." This established the principle. No internal politics would be allowed to compromise the constitutional status of any Turkish citizen.
But even as the government was asserting this powerful internal principle, external forces were trying to pull Turkey into that rising tide of fascism.
And here's where the tension really escalates. Starting around 1937, the German state launched a concerted propaganda campaign led by Paul Leverkusen, the Middle East agent for the Abwehr.
That's Admiral Canaris's intelligence service.
Exactly. And their goal was explicit. Secure Turkish adherence to the Axis by heavily emphasizing anti-Semitism and highlighting the alleged instability caused by non-Turkish elements.
How bold were these operations inside Turkey? I mean, our sources describe a serious attempt at state infiltration.
Oh, they were incredibly bold. American diplomatic reports from 1936 describe the establishment of numerous Nazi organizations right in Istanbul. This included the Gestapo-controlled Teutonia Club and local chapters of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, and the Hitler Youth.
And crucially, the reports note that membership in the Arbeitsfront, which secured employment, was compulsory for German males living in Turkey,
subjecting them to military discipline.
So if you were a German citizen working in Istanbul, you were essentially drafted into a Nazi organization. And if you weren't sympathetic,
you faced blacklisting and job loss, according to those same American documents. They established these organizations right across the street from the American consulate just to demonstrate their power.
But despite this internal pressure and external threat, Turkish resistance was evident, both officially and popularly.
Yes, and we see that resistance in the media, which is always an interesting gauge of public sentiment.
It is.
While extreme right-wing groups published anti-Semitic articles, most Turkish public opinion and the majority of journalists, like Zekeriya Sertel of the major newspaper Tan, vigorously condemned them.
And more importantly, the Turkish government closed the German Information Office in late 1939 after it had the audacity to publish articles criticizing Turkey's newly signed alliances,
showing the line they were not willing to cross.
But the most concrete example of popular resistance to the Nazi influence, the one that really stuck with me, is the 1938 Tokatli Hotel incident. That shows the Turkish public voting with their wallets.
That's right. Following the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, the Austrian-German manager of the famous Tokatli Hotel, a man named Medovich, decided to fly the German flag,
which immediately triggered a massive Jewish boycott of the hotel.
But what elevates this from just a local dispute to a national moment is that the general Turkish public quickly joined the boycott.
Even when there was local media resistance to the boycott itself.
Exactly. The newspaper Cumhuriyet, run by Yunus Nadi, published editorials that were explicitly pro-Nazi and critical of the Jewish boycott. But the public outcry was so significant that Istanbul's Jewish leaders successfully appealed to President Inannu,
who eventually ordered Nadi to cease publishing the anti-Jewish editorials.
And the sustained public boycott caused so much damage that the Tokatli Hotel eventually closed following the war. This confirmed that the principle of citizen protection was deeply rooted enough to resist powerful foreign political influence.
Okay, so we've established this historical precedent for asylum, and the early signs of official resistance to anti-Semitism. Now, let's pivot to a proactive intervention that was one of the most remarkable acts of rescue and really nation-building during this era.
The intellectual rescue of the 1930s.
Yes.
This section highlights an incredible instance of strategic state action. The Turkish Republic looked at the persecution unfolding in Germany, particularly the forced dismissal of thousands of professionals due to Nazi race laws.
And leveraged that crisis for its own gain.
Completely. It was a massive institutional upgrade. Turkey was actively modernizing its major institutions, most notably Istanbul and Ankara universities, and it needed world-class expertise to do it quickly.
So they executed this organized, large-scale recruitment effort.
They did. The Republic took in hundreds of refugee professionals, professors, scientists, physicians, attorneys, artists, and thousands of less well-known individuals, often within just 6 months of them being dismissed by the Nazi regime, mostly because they were Jewish.
And the scale here is key. They weren't just given, adjunct roles. They were given senior academic positions and the resources to found and direct critical scientific research institutes.
It's an intellectual gold rush facilitated by Nazi cruelty.
That's a great way to put it.
It was a monumental transfer of knowledge. If you look at the fields they impacted, medicine, law, public administration, science, these scholars didn't just teach courses. They laid the foundations for modern Turkish professional practice.
Can you give us a few examples of these individuals and why their refuge in Turkey proved so significant, not just for Turkey, but for global intellectual history?
Well, there are names that are simply giants in their fields. Take the labor economist Alfred Isaac. He directed the business course at Istanbul University from 1937 to 1951. He fundamentally shaped modern Turkish economic thought.
And in medicine.
Rudolf Nissen, a professor of surgery who headed the eye surgical clinic at Istanbul University. He trained numerous Turkish professionals in advanced surgical techniques, many of which were life-saving innovations at the time.
But for me, the most stunning example is the literary scholar. It changes the entire context of a major piece of Western literature.
You're referring to Erich Auerbach.
Yes.
He was a professor of Roman philology at Istanbul University, and while he was in exile in Turkey during the war years, he wrote Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature.
Think about that for a moment. This foundational text of Western literary criticism, a comprehensive analysis of how reality has been depicted from Homer all the way to modernism, was written by a Jewish refugee professor in Istanbul, using the university library's limited resources during the height of World War II.
It's an intellectual triumph forged in exile. That insight alone just fundamentally alters our understanding of how high culture survived the catastrophe of fascism. It really speaks to the sanctuary provided by Istanbul University.
It does. And the talent wasn't limited to academia. Consider Ernst Reuter.
A major political figure. He had been the socialist mayor of Magdeburg in Germany. He found refuge in Turkey, where he taught urban planning.
And after the war, he returned to Germany and became the legendary mayor of West Berlin during the crucial period of the Berlin airlift.
Turkey literally sheltered a future global political leader.
So these were not marginal appointments. These were highly sought-after experts. What were the specific conditions of their employment? Were they just allowed to teach as they wished?
Not at all. The conditions reflected the government's dual goal, saving lives and extracting maximum institutional benefit. They were hired on rigorous 2-, 3-, or 5-year contracts.
And they were paid well.
They were often paid significantly higher salaries than their Turkish counterparts, which immediately caused some resentment, but it also reflected their scarcity and expertise.
And the mandatory localization efforts?
That was the core trade-off. They were required, often within their first contract period, to learn Turkish and teach in Turkish.
So they couldn't just lecture in German?
No. And they were also strictly obligated to write textbooks, manuals, and scientific papers that could be translated into Turkish for their students. This ensured the knowledge they brought was immediately integrated into the national educational system, making the modernization permanent.
This sounds incredibly ambitious. I can't imagine this went completely smoothly. You mentioned resentment earlier.
Yes.
How did the Turkish system react to this rapid top-down infusion of foreign intellectual capital?
Well, the friction was real and it was significant. American diplomatic reports from the time confirmed considerable tension between the newly arrived scholars and the established Turkish academic community and their assistants.
So many Turkish professionals felt they were being passed over for the most prestigious and highest-paying professorships.
Which were going to the refugees, yes. So you had a situation where the Turkish assistants were sometimes actively working against their new, globally renowned supervisors.
So they were ignoring them, or even trying to sabotage their work.
There are records of Turkish assistants sometimes ignoring, resenting, or even attempting to sabotage the activities and instructions of the refugee professors. This paints a very human picture of the situation. Success achieved not through perfect harmony, but through sheer determination on both sides.
But despite the friction, the sources are clear on the ultimate outcome.
The overall outcome was an undeniable success. This group of scholars forced out of Germany successfully transferred their knowledge and expertise, contributing massively to the modernization of Turkish law, medicine, science, and education. Even those who, like Hans Winterstein, later retired to Germany after the war, left behind a modernized system. It was a complex, self-interested, but ultimately life-saving intellectual rescue.
Now we transition from a chapter of intellectual triumph and humanitarian success to what our sources call the darkest chapter of this era. This is the moment that really demonstrates the profound internal contradictions of Turkey's wartime state.
The Varlık Vergisi, or wealth tax, disaster of 1942.
It's a crucial section because we cannot view Turkey's role monolithically. The context for this tax was dire.
By 1942, Turkey had mobilized its armed forces to maintain neutrality in the face of imminent threat, and this mobilization just crippled the economy.
The numbers detailing the economic collapse are staggering.
They are. National defense spending soared, rising from 164 million Turkish lira in 1938 to 542 million by 1943. This created massive budgetary deficits.
And at the same time, you have this wild, crippling inflation.
The price index for raw materials exploded from 100 in 1938 to 453.3 in 1943. There were severe shortages of food, fuel, essential supplies across the country.
And this collapse created severe political pressure, particularly against those who were perceived as benefiting from the crisis.
Precisely. There was widespread popular agitation against war profiteers, individuals who were hoarding supplies, driving up prices, and making massive fortunes while the general population suffered.
So the tax was enacted in November 1942 with the immediate legitimate goal of raising emergency revenue to cover the wartime deficits.
But the structure of the wealth tax, while theoretically universal, carried some very specific socio-political intentions that targeted certain segments of the population.
That's the key distinction. Officially, it was a capital levy on all property owners.
But the unofficial, unspoken goals quickly became apparent. Generating revenue, yes, but also stifling Nazi support among some Christian businessmen, and most critically, limiting the role and the easily accessible wealth of non-Muslims in the marketplace.
So primarily Jewish, Greek, and Armenian merchants who tended to operate in urban centers and hold liquid assets.
Exactly. And this is where the disaster and execution begins. It wasn't just a heavy tax. It was an arbitrary mechanism of state-sanctioned discrimination.
How is the tax even assessed?
The structure itself was designed for speed and a lack of oversight. Local assessment commissions, the Mahalli Takdir Komisyonları, were formed. These commissions, comprising finance ministry officials and local notables, were given the power to make assessments based on highly limited, often subjective information.
So their decisions were based on rumor, hearsay, or maybe even political motivation, rather than rigorous accounting.
That's exactly right. The assessment was arbitrary in the extreme.
Right.
They'd often tax individuals far more or occasionally less than they actually possessed. And here is the element that made it a tool of immediate ruin. Decisions could not be appealed.
No appeal.
And payment was demanded within a very, very short period, sometimes as little as 2 weeks.
So if you were assessed an impossible amount, say a million lira, and you only had half that in cash, what happened? You can't appeal, and you can't pay in 2 weeks.
The consequences were swift and brutal. Those lacking liquidity, which included many non-Muslims who were forced to pay these staggering amounts, had 3 ruinous choices. Sell all the remaining assets instantly at fire sale prices, declare bankruptcy, or
Be sent to work off their debts on government projects.
which led to the labor camps, most notoriously Askeli.
Askeli, in eastern Turkey near Erzurum. That transition from a tax assessment to forced labor is just devastating. What were the logistics and conditions of these labor camps?
The first train caravan of delinquent taxpayers left Istanbul for Askil on January 27, 1943. And this wasn't a punishment for a crime, but for a debt they couldn't possibly pay in the required time frame.
That first train carried 32 men.
But over the next few months, hundreds followed. In total, 2,057 people were sent to holding camps, though about 2/3 eventually reached Askil itself after exhausting all efforts to pay their debts.
And the numbers highlight the disproportionate impact on Istanbul's non-Muslim population.
Absolutely. Of the 1,400 sent to Oskale in 1943, 1,229 came from Istanbul. They were forced to perform difficult labor, often in harsh winter conditions. Our sources indicate that 21 people died in the holding camps and at Oskale.
It's just, for comparison, the Turkish Republic was simultaneously providing refuge to intellectuals while forcing thousands of its own citizens into labor camps simply because they couldn't pay an arbitrarily assessed tax.
Exactly.
How is this policy viewed internally? Were there Turkish critics at the time who saw the injustice?
Yes, definitely. The prominent Turkish journalist Ahmet Emin Yalman, who was himself of Jewish heritage, was critical of the application of the law.
But he accepted the general need for a capital levy.
Initially, yes. Given the refusal of commercial circles, including minorities, to financially support national defense. But he pointed out the fundamental flaw. If you were arbitrarily assessed 800,000 lira but only possessed 500,000, you paid everything you had, yet still remained indebted by 300,000 lira and could still be exiled to the labor camps. He noted the enforcement created an atmosphere of terror.
The arbitrary nature meant that even full compliance didn't prevent future punishment. When was the tax finally abolished?
It was eventually abolished in March 1944. All remaining indebtedness was officially erased, and those left in the labor camps were allowed to return home.
But Yalman pointed out the further injustice there.
Right, because those who had paid their arbitrarily high assessments in full were effectively penalized, having lost their entire assets, while those who had resisted payment until the end benefited from the total debt erasure. It was an economically and morally devastating policy.
So we return to the core paradox. This was government-sponsored persecution that destroyed livelihoods, but how does it sit alongside the fact that Turkey was saving Jews from the Holocaust?
This is the crucial nuance the source material insists upon. Although the Varlık Vergisi was highly detrimental, it was not accompanied by organized, government-sponsored, racial, or anti-Semitic propaganda of the Nazi type. Jewish Turks not affected by the tax continued their normal lives.
So the community's sober conclusion was what?
It was this. While some of their members suffered terrible loss and forced labor, the government was simultaneously saving all Jews in the country and many others from the certain systematic murder of the Nazi extermination camps. The worst they faced was economic ruin and forced labor. They did not face Auschwitz. And that context matters immensely to the people living through it.
If the wealth tax represents the state's internal failure, the diplomatic intervention abroad represents its ultimate moral and constitutional success.
I think that's a fair way to put it. This mission was focused on saving Turkish citizens, and often former citizens, trapped in Nazi-occupied territories, particularly in France.
And the crisis began because of Turkey's own evolving and frankly complex citizenship laws, which created a time bomb for many long-term expatriates.
It did. While the 1923 Constitution made all permanent residents Turkish citizens, a 1935 law introduced a stringent requirement: automatic loss of citizenship for those who lived abroad too long or failed to register with a Turkish consulate every 5 years.
Every 5 years. And many Jewish Turks who had been living in France, some for generations, had allowed their citizenship to lapse by 1940.
Believing they were safely integrated into French society.
And suddenly, that piece of paper, the Turkish passport, became the difference between life and death as the Nazis conquered France.
This led to desperate, urgent appeals from people who had previously, perhaps pragmatically, abandoned their Turkish status for the perceived comfort of being a French citizen.
Their fears were realized immediately. After the 1940 conquest, German military ordinances enforced immediate registration of Jews, their exclusion from trade and commerce.
The Aryanization of their businesses, the seizure of their property, concentration camps like Drancy were established near Paris, primarily for foreign Jews intended for deportation to Auschwitz. Being foreign and Jewish was the highest risk category you could be in.
But the Turkish diplomatic corps, operating through the embassy in Vichy and consulates in Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, Grenoble, stepped in fiercely to protect its citizens. What was the bedrock of their argument?
The diplomats, led by figures who became these quiet heroes like Vice-Consul Namık Kemal Yolga and Necdet Kent, anchored their entire defense on one non-negotiable legal point.
Which was?
The Turkish constitutional law makes absolutely no distinction among citizens based on religion. They stressed that a Turkish Jew was constitutionally the same as a Turkish Muslim. The Germans and the Vichy regime consistently pushed back, insisting that foreign citizens must accept French anti-Jewish laws. The Turkish diplomats simply refused to concede this point.
And we could see the tangible results of this refusal in the archival documents themselves. The sources include records of businesses that were saved from confiscation.
Yes, consular documents, like the one referenced in Appendix 5, show dozens of businesses, lighting equipment shops, hosiery firms, textile stores belonging to Jewish Turks in Paris that were actively administered by Turkish agents in 1943. This protected them from the widespread Nazi policy of seizing Jewish property.
And the diplomats had to intervene for even basic rights.
Like demanding that the Germans unseal the apartments and businesses of Turkish citizens who had been arrested, like in the case of the Hatem family.
These diplomats were placing themselves in direct confrontation with the Gestapo and the Vichy police, putting their own safety at risk. Tell us about the testimony of Necdet Kent, the vice consul at Marseille, Grenoble.
Kent's testimony captures the sheer audacity that was required. He recounted that the Gestapo was actively using physical examination, specifically checking for circumcision, to determine who was Jewish and therefore eligible for arrest.
Yeah.
So Kent went directly to Gestapo headquarters to argue against this practice. When the German officers expressed disbelief that a non-Jew would be circumcised, Kent offered himself for examination. He demanded they check him to prove that circumcision was common among Muslims in Turkey as well.
That is an incredible act of personal and diplomatic defiance. He put his own body on the line to uphold the constitutional principle he was defending.
And that principle gave him immense power. But the most dramatic story, the one that really defines this rescue, is the train rescue he undertook.
Let's detail that moment.
Kent learned through intelligence from the Jewish community in Marseille that approximately 80 Jewish Turks had been loaded onto cattle wagons at the St. Charles Railroad Station.
Destined for a concentration camp in Germany, which meant ultimately Auschwitz.
Yes. Kent rushed to the station. Finding the train secured, he didn't just protest, he demanded access. Once he was inside the cattle wagon with his clerk, Sidi Iskin, he refused to leave.
He physically inserted himself onto the deportation train.
He did. Hours later, the train stopped, possibly in Arles or Nimes, and German officers confronted him, demanding he disembark. Kent stood his ground. He told them that loading more than 80 Turkish citizens onto an animal wagon simply because they were Jews was a profound error, and he would not leave until they were released.
Because his government maintained that religious beliefs could not cause such treatment.
That level of principled resistance, knowing what the German regime was capable of, is just astonishing.
It is.
Faced with his unwavering refusal to compromise or get off the train, the German officers had no diplomatic choice but to capitulate. They received orders, likely from higher up in Vichy or Paris, who feared the diplomatic fallout with a neutral Turkey, to release all the Turkish citizens.
And Kent recalled the sheer relief and gratitude of the people who were saved.
They surrounded him and his clerk at the station. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Ambassador Namik Kemal Yolga performed similar interventions in Paris, successfully interceding directly with German railroad officials at Drancy to pull Jewish Turks off deportation trains destined for the East.
The intervention saved lives, but then the diplomatic staff had to coordinate the massive logistical operation of getting these people home.
And the logistics were complex. Repatriation was arranged in large convoys or caravans, primarily routed through Italy. The Balkan states were often resistant to granting transit visas to Jews, making the passage difficult.
But by 1944, the efforts resulted in 2,944 passports being issued.
To 4,594 Jewish Turks being repatriated from various European cities. And the sources even give us a snapshot of the economic trust placed in the Turkish consulates during this harrowing period.
That's right. Appendix 6 shows the significant sums of money, tens of thousands of French francs, that these repatriated Jewish Turks deposited with the Paris Consulate General for transfer back to Turkey between February and April 1944.
It shows their trust in the diplomatic infrastructure, even as Europe was collapsing around them.
So once they arrived home at the Sirkechi terminus in Istanbul, what became of them?
The local Jewish community, led by the chief rabbinate, took immediate charge, providing housing, food, and care. Even those young men of military age who had spent their entire lives abroad were immediately conscripted into the Turkish army, where they served alongside their Muslim and Jewish counterparts.
The success rate of this mission is truly staggering.
It is. Of the tens of thousands of Jews of all nationalities imprisoned at Drancy, the bulk of those who survived were Jewish Turks, saved directly by the unwavering, risk-laden efforts of the Turkish government and its diplomatic corps in France.
So the diplomatic rescue of citizens was a success born of constitutional commitment. But the other side of Turkey's role was its status as a crucial, if highly cautious, transit hub for thousands of European Jews who were not Turkish citizens.
For the international Jewish aid organizations, Istanbul became the most vital operational center in Europe. The Jewish agency's rescue operations, led by Jean Barlas, were centered there. By 1942, as Sweden and Switzerland became increasingly isolated or unwilling to assist, Istanbul became the key bridge between occupied Europe and Palestine.
Barlas and his colleagues faced an enormous challenge: getting information, food, and medicine to Jews trapped under Nazi control, and coordinating escape routes through the highly sensitive neutral territory of Turkey toward Palestine.
The political tightrope Turkey walked here was extremely thin. They remained strictly neutral, terrified of provoking Germany into invasion, and wary of a massive, unmanageable influx of refugees, especially given the ongoing food and economic crisis we discussed.
Right. So what was the official policy on transit visas?
The government's decision was to allow transit visas for Jewish refugees, but only under one critical, firm condition. The refugee had to possess a valid entry visa for their destination country.
Which was overwhelmingly British-controlled Palestine.
Exactly. Which meant the flow was controlled not just by Turkey, but critically by British policy.
The Jewish agency petitioned Turkey to formalize this process, recognizing that speed was essential to saving lives.
And in January 1941, the Council of Ministers formally allowed the issuance of transit visas, but they built in a restrictive mechanism. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs would determine the maximum number of transit visas which could be issued by each consulate during each 2-week period.
So it was an active bureaucratic mechanism to prevent the flow from becoming a mass immigration that could compromise Turkey's neutrality or domestic stability.
It was controlled caution.
And it's important to stress here, if Turkey was providing a cautious bridge, the Allies, specifically the British, were, in many documented cases, actively trying to demolish that bridge.
This is one of the most damning findings in the archival sources. The British government was actively trying to discourage illegal Jewish immigration to Palestine. Why? Because they feared antagonizing the Arab populations more than they feared the consequences for the Jewish refugees. We know this from British Foreign Office minutes.
And what did those minutes reveal about their calculation?
A British Foreign Office official explicitly noted that if they antagonized the Jewish population, the Jews had no alternative but to adhere to the British cause. Whereas if they antagonized the Arabs by allowing mass immigration, the Arabs could potentially shift their allegiance to the Axis powers.
So geopolitical expediency dictated restriction.
It did. They even restricted refugees from coming into Britain itself, unless in some quite rare and exceptional cases.
That cautious, restrictive policy, driven by geopolitical concerns in Palestine, led directly to one of the greatest tragedies of the era, the Struma disaster.
The British policy hardened in May 1942 with the decision to take all practicable steps to discourage illegal immigration and to place any future shiploads that reached Palestine into detention camps. They noted these measures were put in place specifically to avoid a recurrence of the Struma disaster.
The Struma was a vessel carrying Jewish refugees that had been denied docking and provisioning in Istanbul due to Turkish policy dictated by the British position.
And the ship was eventually forced back into the Black Sea, where it sank, killing nearly 800 people.
So the geopolitical reality meant that even when refugees reached the gate of salvation Turkey, they could still be pushed back to their deaths by the policies of the global powers.
Exactly. The pressure was immense. However, international humanitarian figures still found ways to operate effectively from Istanbul, often utilizing their political capital with the Turkish government.
Who were the key international players making a difference in Istanbul?
2 figures really stand out. First, Monsignor Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, who served as the apostolic delegate in Turkey from 1935 to 1944.
And who would later become Pope John XXIII.
Right. Despite operating without strong encouragement from the Vatican itself, Roncalli used his influence to arrange for the Turkish government to send critical food shipments to starving Jews and Greeks in occupied Greece. He was known for his genuine affinity for the local population. He often wrote in his personal letters, "I love the Turks."
And he found a way to use bureaucratic mechanisms to save lives, even for Hungarian Jews much later in the war.
He did. Roncalli used the technical device of issuing documents for conversions of convenience. This allowed large numbers of Hungarian Jews to be categorized differently, facilitating their rescue and escape from deportation and death through Turkish and diplomatic channels.
And the second major figure was the American delegate of the newly formed War Refugee Board.
That was Ira Hirschman, who was sent to Istanbul in 1944. The U.S. government, finally recognizing the scope of the atrocity, sent Hirschman to initiate and assist rescue projects.
And he was highly effective.
Very. He coordinated relief efforts, established connections, and upon returning to the U.S., he successfully led fundraising campaigns, which ultimately resulted in American relief organizations distributing over $215,000 in Turkey for Jewish refugees.
So despite the restrictive Turkish policy and the active obstruction by the British government, the sheer pressure of humanity seeking escape meant a significant number still passed through this critical hub.
The numbers confirm Turkey's vital role. According to the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee figures, a total of 16,474 official Jewish immigrants passed through Turkey during the war on their way to Palestine.
And that's in addition to estimates of around 75,000 unofficial refugees who transited the country by various means.
The Jewish Agency Office in Istanbul alone distributed over £500,000 in aid to Jews trapped in Nazi-occupied Europe. Turkey was, by necessity, the narrow and cautiously controlled gateway to salvation.
This deep dive really forces us to stop viewing the historical role of nation-states during the war in terms of simple binaries, friend or foe, refuge or persecutor.
Right.
Turkey operated in a highly contradictory moral gray zone.
The internal contradictions are immense and demand honest reflection. On one hand, the state enacted the Varlık Vergisi disaster, a severe economic policy that punished thousands of its own non-Muslim citizens and led to forced labor and ruination. This was a governmental failure rooted in political expediency and discrimination.
And yet, simultaneously, you have the diplomatic corps figures like Necdet Kent and Namık Kemal Yolga, who heroically defied the most dangerous political apparatus in history, often at personal risk, to save citizens and former citizens from certain death.
And Turkey functioned as the crucial transit bridge for tens of thousands of European Jews fleeing the extermination machine, a gate that remained open even when powerful allies were trying to shut it down.
The key takeaway for you, the learner, is understanding the sheer complexity of survival. For Jewish Turks, the profound risk of losing property and assets due to the wealth tax coexisted with the absolute certainty that their diplomatic protection offered salvation from the far greater existential threat posed by the Nazis.
The worst thing they faced was losing their economic standing and being sent to Ashkel, not being sent to the gas chambers of Auschwitz.
And the success of the diplomatic corps in France speaks to a fundamental principle that transcended the political failures of the Varlık Vergisi. They were empowered by the belief, which was enshrined in the Turkish constitutional law, that protection must be provided to all citizens without distinction based on religion.
And that leads to our final provocative thought. Consider how the unwavering, non-negotiable commitment of a small number of diplomats, empowered by this single foundational legal concept of non-distinction based on belief, managed to save lives that major global powers, including the British government, were actively trying to prevent from reaching safety.
The difference between a country where the state sees all its citizens as constitutionally equal and one that operates on racial or geopolitical hierarchy proved in that moment to be the ultimate determinant of survival.